Don't touch the upholstery with your bare hands, Noah. This car is worth more than your entire life." The voice belonged to Julian Vane, a man whose net worth was only eclipsed by his profound insecurity. He didn't look at me as he spoke. He was too busy adjusting his silk cufflinks in the gilded mirror of the foyer, prepping himself for the gala that was currently roaring like a hungry beast in the ballroom behind him. To him, I wasn't a man. I was a specialized tool, a biological GPS designed to steer his armored Maybach through the city S vein so he could drink scotch and talk about disrupting the market. I did exactly as I was told. I pulled my hands back, keeping my fingers away from the pristine leather. I didn't breathe too loudly. I stood in the shadow of the cloakroom, a ghost in a black suit, watching the elite of the city drift past like brightly colored tropical fish, oblivious to the thickness of the glass holding them in. "Did you hear me, Noah?" Julian turned, his eyes flickering over me with the same casual dismissal one might give a piece of furniture that had been moved an inch to the left. "I heard you, Mr. Vane," I replied. My voice was a flat, controlled lake. No ripples, no wind. "Good, stay by the car. I might want to leave early if the board members start boring me with their sustainability metrics. And for God's sake, pull your collar up. You look like you're attending a funeral." I watched him walk away, his laughter joining a chorus of other expensive, forced laughs. The heavy oak doors swung shut, muffled the violin music, and left me in the sterile silence of the hallway. No one in that room knew they were about to make the worst mistake of their lives. They saw a driver. They saw a man whose highest ambition was a clean windshield and a full tank of gas. They didn't see the way I was measuring the room. No one in that room knew they were about to make the worst mistake of their lives. They saw a driver. They saw a man whose highest ambition was a clean windshield and a full tank of gas. They didn't see the way I was measuring the room. They didn't see that I knew the exact valuation of every company represented in that hall, not because I had read the brochures, but because I had once signed their founding charters. They thought they were the architects of the world. They didn't realize they were just guests in a house I had built, lived in, and then walked away from 3 years ago. I walked back out to the driveway. The night air was biting, smelling of wet pavement and expensive perfume. I leaned against the Maybach, the engine still ticking as it cooled. Across the street, a massive digital billboard flickered. It showed a silhouette of a man, a tech titan who had vanished from the public eye years ago, leaving a multi-billion-dollar vacuum behind. The media called him a ghost. Julian called him a myth. I checked my watch, 8:15 p.m. In exactly 4 hours, the shadow I had been living in would start to retreat. But as I looked at my reflection in the tinted window of the car, the cheap tie, the tired eyes, the nameless face, I wondered if the world was ready for what was coming back. I wasn't just here to drive Julian Vane home. I was here to witness the moment his world, and the worlds of everyone in that ballroom began to tilt off their axes. But to understand the weight of the keys I just put on that table, you have to understand the man who spent 3 years learning how to be invisible. My name is Noah, and for the last 1,000 days, I have been the man who sees everything and says nothing. That was about to change. My alarm goes off at 4:15 a.m. It's a digital beep, sharp and emotionless, cutting through the silence of a 12 by 12 studio apartment that smells faintly of old coffee and damp concrete. I don't hit the snooze button. I never have. I sat on the edge of the narrow bed, the springs protesting with a familiar metallic groan. The floor was cold, the kind of cold that seeps into your bones and stays there all day. I dressed in the dark, white shirt, starched stiff, black tie, knotted with a precision that was purely habitual, black suit jacket, thin at the elbows but immaculately brushed. When I looked in the mirror, I didn't look for Noah. I looked for the driver. The driver has no opinions. The driver has no history. The driver is a silent observer of the road, a man who exists in the periphery of high-stakes conversations. I practiced the expression, neutral, chin slightly down, eyes focused but vacant. It was a mask I had spent 3 years perfecting. I walked to the garage through the pre-dawn fog. The city was quiet, the skyscrapers looming like tombstones through the mist. This was the hour of the invisible. The janitors, the bakers, the delivery drivers. We moved in a synchronized ballet of the overlooked. At the garage, the fleet manager, a man named Henderson who smelled of cigarettes and cheap cologne, tossed me the clipboard without looking up. "Vane's car is in Bay 4, Noah." He complained about a clinking sound in the rear left. Said if it isn't silky, he's docking your weekend bonus. "Again, I'll take care of it," I said. "You always do," Henderson muttered, finally glancing at me. "I don't get you, kid. You're too precise for this job. You drive like you're transporting the president, and you take the abuse like you've had the soul beaten out of you. You ever think about, I don't know, fighting back? Or at least scowling once in a while? I didn't answer. I just walked to Bay 4. The Maybach sat there, a black monolith of German engineering. It was a beautiful machine, but to me, it was just a cage on wheels. I opened the door, the scent of expensive leather and Julian's heavy cologne wafting out. I began my morning ritual, checking the fluids, wiping the dash, ensuring the temperature was set to exactly 68 degrees, Julian's preferred climate. I spent 40 minutes on the rear suspension, finding the clinking sound. It wasn't a coin. It was a loose trim clip that had been improperly installed at the factory. I fixed it with a flick of a screwdriver. As I worked, I thought about the hierarchy of this city. Julian thought he was at the top because he sat in the back seat. Henderson thought he was in the middle because he gave the orders. And they both thought I was at the bottom because I held the wheel. But I knew the truth. The man at the wheel is the only one who knows where the car is actually going. The drive to Julian's estate was a blur of gray highway and blinking brake lights. I arrived at exactly 6:30 a.m., not 6:29, not 6:31. Precision was my only armor. Julian stepped out of his mansion 10 minutes late. He was on the phone shouting at someone about a Series B funding round that was falling apart. He didn't look at me as I held the door open. He didn't thank me. He just slid into the back, his aura of stress and arrogance filling the cabin like a gas leak. Drive, Noah, and avoid the 4th Street Bridge. I can't stand the sight of the construction crews this early. It's depressing. Understood, sir. I pulled away smoothly, the V12 engine purring with a suppressed power that mirrored my own. As we moved through the city, Julian continued to scream into his phone, throwing around names of venture capital firms and private equity titans. He mentioned the Thorn Initiative. He spoke about that entity with a fearful reverence as if it were a god on Mount Olympus. I kept my eyes on the road, but my grip on the steering wheel tightened almost imperceptibly. He had no idea that I had written the bylaws for the Thorn Initiative. He had no idea that the disruption he was so proud of was based on a white paper I had published under a pseudonym 5 years ago. To Julian, I was a background character in the movie of his life. To me, he was just a passenger in a world I had already moved on from. We spent the afternoon running errands that were beneath him, but essential for his ego. Dropping off a watch to be serviced, picking up a vintage wine for a client. Each time I opened the door, I was met with a new complaint. The car was too warm. The car was too cold. The traffic was my fault. The rain was my fault. At lunch, he had me wait in the car for 3 hours while he ate at a restaurant where the appetizers cost more than my monthly rent. I sat there, a statue in a suit, watching the elite walk past. Once, a young intern from Julian's office walked by and tossed a half-eaten sandwich wrapper near the front tire. He didn't even see me sitting there. I was part of the machinery. I was as significant as the curb. I didn't feel anger. I felt a strange, cold satisfaction. The more invisible I became, the more I could see. And what I saw was a world built on paper-thin foundations, held up by men like Julian who were terrified of the wind changing as the sun began to set, casting long, jagged shadows over the city. Julian tapped on the glass partition. Noah, we're heading to the office. I have a meeting with the investors. Don't be late picking me up. If you're even a minute off, don't bother coming back tomorrow. I'll be there, sir, I said. I watched him walk into the glass tower, his reflection stretching out and distorting on the shiny surface. He thought he was walking into a room to claim his future. I knew he was walking into a room where his past was finally catching up to him. But first, I had to survive the evening. I had to survive the pressure loop. The office was a cathedral of glass and ego, and I was parked at its base like a discarded gargoyle. Julian's meeting with investors had run over by 2 hours. On the street, the temperature had plummeted, and a biting sleet began to pepper the windshield. I sat in the driver's seat with the engine off. Julian didn't allow the car to idle because he claimed the vibration disturbed his focus when he entered. So, I sat in the freezing dark, my breath blooming in white clouds before me. When the glass doors finally slid open, Julian didn't come out alone. He was flanked by 2 other executives, men in tailored overcoats who laughed at jokes I couldn't hear. Julian spotted the Maybach and his face tightened. He didn't like that I was just sitting there, appearing unproductive. As they reached the car, Julian didn't wait for me to step out. He wrapped his heavy signet ring against the window, a sharp, metallic clack-clack-clack that set my teeth on edge. "Wake up, Noah. We don't pay you to sleep on the job," he barked, though I had been staring wide awake at the road for hours. I stepped out, the sleet hitting my face, and moved to open the rear door. As I did, one of the executives, a man named Sterling, paused. He looked at me, then at Julian. "Julian, is this the one you were telling me about, the monument to silence?" Sterling chuckled, reaching out to flick the lapel of my cheap suit jacket. A bit frayed, isn't he? You'd think with the margins you're clearing, you could afford a driver who doesn't look like he lives in a shelter. Julian's jaw tightened. He hated being perceived as cheap. He's functional, Sterling, like a reliable lawnmower. You don't polish a lawnmower, you just use it until it breaks. They piled into the back. The car settled under their weight, and the air immediately filled with the smell of expensive bourbon and sweat. "The club, Noah," Julian ordered, "and take the long way. We need to discuss the merger without being jostled by the potholes on 5th. I pulled into the traffic. Through the rearview mirror, I could see them. They were passing around a tablet, looking at spreadsheets that represented thousands of lives, layoffs, restructuring, efficiency gains. "We need to squeeze the Thorne legacy accounts," Sterling said, leaning in. "If we can prove their infrastructure is outdated, we can buy the remaining patents for pennies. The guy who built it has been gone for years. He's probably dead in a ditch somewhere or living under a bridge. He won't fight back." "He was a fool," Julian added, swirling his drink. "He built a kingdom and walked away because of ethics. In this world, ethics are just a luxury for people who can't afford to win." I kept my hands at 10 and 2. My pulse didn't jump, but in my mind, I was looking at the very patents they were talking about. I knew the encryption keys. I knew the backdoors I had built into the software, not for malice, but for the very reason they were discussing now, to prevent men like Julian from stealing what they didn't understand. The humiliation deepened when we arrived at the club. The valet, a kid no older than 20, looked at me with a mix of pity and disdain. Julian stepped out and realized he had forgotten his umbrella. "Noah," he said, not looking back, "the trunk. Get the umbrella. Walk us to the door." I grabbed the large black golf umbrella and stepped into the downpour. I held it over Julian and Sterling, my own shoulder and arm instantly soaked as I prioritized their dry suits. We walked toward the entrance, a slow, degrading procession. At the door, the bouncer whispered something to Julian, and they both looked at me. "Actually, Noah," Julian said, a cruel glint in his eye, "I left my briefcase in the office, on the 3rd floor, in the conference room." "Sir, the office is locked now," I said quietly. "Then call security. Get the keys. Do whatever you have to do. I need those documents before I leave this club tonight. If they aren't in my hand when I walk out, don't bother showing up for the morning shift." He knew the briefcase wasn't there. I had seen him put it in his locker at the gym earlier that day. This wasn't about the documents. This was about reminding me that my time belonged to him. It was a test of my discipline. I stood in the rain, watching the heavy doors of the club close. I was soaked to the bone. My shoes were ruined. My dignity, in the eyes of any onlooker, was non-existent. I walked back to the car. I didn't drive to the office. I sat in the driver's seat and pulled a small, battered notebook from the sun visor. Inside were names, dates, and account numbers. For 3 years, I had been the silent passenger to their crimes. I had heard the insider trading tips whispered in the back seat. I had seen the mistress drop-offs. I had recorded the verbal abuse. Julian thought I was a lawnmower. He forgot that a lawnmower has blades. I checked my phone. A private alert flashed on the screen. A single line of text from an encrypted server. "The shadow is at its longest. The board is set." I looked at my reflection in the mirror. The rain was dripping off my nose. I looked pathetic. I looked like a man who had reached his breaking point, and that was exactly what I needed them to see. Because a man who has lost everything is a man they no longer fear, and a man who isn't feared is the only one who can truly destroy them. I started the engine. I didn't go to the office. I went to the one place Julian told me I was never allowed to go, the private archives of the Thorne Initiative. It was time to stop being the driver and start being the architect again. The following morning, the air in the Maybach was thick with the smell of wet wool and Julian's hungover irritability. I hadn't slept. I had spent the night in the archives, watching digital ghosts of my former life flicker across a screen in a basement 3 levels below the city's notice. Julian didn't ask if I had found the briefcase. He didn't have to. He knew it had been a ghost hunt. He simply sat in the back, nursing a headache and scrolling through an invite on his phone. "Noah," he said, his voice raspy. "What's the date of the Founders Gala at the Blackwood Estate?" "It's this Friday, sir. The 18th. "Right." He looked out the window, a slow, malicious smile spreading across his face. "Sterling and the boys were talking last night. They think it would be enlightening for you to see the world from the other side of the glass. Just for one night, I kept my eyes on the road." "I'm not sure I understand, sir. It's a costume party, Noah. High society playing at being common. The theme is the industrial age. Sterling thought it would be a riot if I brought my most authentic servant as my guest. You won't be driving that night, you'll be attending. As my +1. He let out a short, sharp bark of a laugh. The cruelty wasn't even disguised, it was the point. He wanted to parade me around like a prize pony, showing his peers how well trained his lawnmower truly was. He wanted to watch me fumbling with the wrong forks and standing awkwardly in a room full of people who wouldn't even look me in the eye unless they were ordering a drink. "You'll wear your uniform," Julian continued. "We'll tell them your performance art. It'll be the talk of the evening. It might even distract the investors from the fact that our third quarter numbers are looking a bit lean." "I see," I said. My voice remained a flat, calm lake, but beneath the surface, a tectonic shift was occurring. "Don't sound so thrilled," Julian snapped. "It's a chore, Noah, not a reward. You'll stand where I tell you, you'll stay silent, and you'll make me look like the most important man in the room. If you can manage not to spill champagne on yourself, there might be a $500 bonus in it for you." "I accept the invitation, Mr. Vane." He looked surprised for a second. He had expected me to plead or make an excuse. "Before this goes any further, take a second. Drop a comment with your prediction. Does this end in humiliation or something much worse? Subscribe and stay with the story." He wanted to hear the small man beg for his dignity. By accepting so readily, I had robbed him of the initial satisfaction of the struggle. "Fine. Be ready by 7. And for God's sake, get a haircut. You look like a drifter." As I dropped him off at the helipad for his afternoon meetings, I watched him walk away. He thought he was inviting a sheep into a wolf's den for the amusement of the pack. He had no way of knowing that the Blackwood estate was built on land I had purchased through a trust 6 years ago. He didn't know that the host, Arthur Blackwood, owed his entire career to a recommendation I had written when I was 25. This wasn't a party. It was a summons. I drove the Maybach back to the garage, but I didn't park it in Bay 4. I took it to a private detailing shop on the outskirts of the industrial district, a place where the owner, an old man named Matteo, didn't ask questions as long as the cash was crisp. "Deep clean?" Matteo asked, looking at the car. "Total scrub," I said. "I need a favor. I need access to the private locker in the back. The one with the seal." Matteo's eyes widened. He looked at me, really looked at me, for the first time in years. He saw the frayed suit, the tired eyes, but he also saw something else, the ghost of the man who used to own the city. "You're going back," Matteo whispered. "No," I said, taking the key he offered. "I'm going home." I walked to the back of the shop, past the screeching of grinders and the smell of oil. In the corner sat a steel locker, untouched by dust. I turned the key. Inside sat a garment bag and a small wooden box. I unzipped the bag. The fabric inside didn't catch the light, it absorbed it. A bespoke midnight blue tuxedo, hand-stitched in London. Beside it, the wooden box held a watch, a Patek Philippe that was never catalogued, a gift from a man whose name was now on the side of the very building Julian worked in. I touched the fabric. It felt like a different life. A life of boardrooms, of grand designs, of a woman who had once looked at me with love before the power poisoned everything. Julian wanted me to attend his party as a servant. He wanted to humiliate the man I had become. But in doing so, he had handed me the one thing I couldn't take for myself, a reason to appear. He thought the industrial age theme was a joke. He didn't realize that I was the one who had built the machinery they were all still using. I looked at my reflection in the polished steel of the locker. The driver was still there, but behind the eyes, the architect was waking up. Friday was 3 days away, 3 days to prepare, 3 days to remember, 3 days until the silence became the loudest thing in the room. The 3 days leading up to the gala were a blur of calculated movements and ghosts. Julian was in high spirits, which meant he was being twice as cruel. He spent his time bragging on the phone about the stunt he was pulling. Every time I adjusted his rearview mirror or held the door, I could feel his eyes on me, searching for a flinch. He wanted to see the dread of the upcoming humiliation. He didn't find it. Instead, he found a man who seemed to have retreated even further into himself. I became a machine. I slept 4 hours a night. The rest of the time was spent in my studio apartment, surrounded by the only things I had kept from my previous life. Not money, but information. I sat on the floor, the light from my laptop the only thing cutting through the dark. On the screen was a blueprint of the Blackwood estate. I knew every service entrance, every camera blind spot, and more importantly, the guest list. I scrolled through the names: Sterling, Vane, Henderson. And then, the name that made my breath hitch, Clara Thorne, my ex-wife, the woman who had stayed with the company when I left. The woman who believed the lie that I had burned out and lost my edge. She would be there, likely on the arm of a man like Julian, someone who viewed the world as a game to be won rather than a legacy to be built. I looked at a small, framed photograph I kept face down on my nightstand. In it We were young, standing on a balcony in Singapore. I looked happy. I looked present. I closed my eyes and could almost smell the jasmine and the humidity. Then, I remembered the way her face had turned to stone the night I told her I couldn't do it anymore. The night I realized the empire we were building was crushing the people we were supposed to be helping. "You're a coward, Noah," she had said, her voice trembling not with sadness, but with rage. "You're walking away from the sun because you're afraid of the heat." I hadn't been afraid of the heat. I was afraid of the fire. I stood up and walked to the midnight blue tuxedo hanging on the back of my door. I ran my hand over the fabric. It felt like a skin I had shed. To put it back on was to invite the fire back in. I had spent 3 years in the cool, quiet shadows of the driver's seat. I had found a strange peace in being nothing. Was I ready to be everything again? The internal conflict gnawed at me. Part of me wanted to cancel, to take the Maybach, drive it into the river, and disappear to a different city under a different name. But then I thought of Julian's ring hitting the glass. I thought of the way they talked about the thorn patents as if they were carrion to be picked over. They weren't just destroying a company, they were destroying the work of 1,000 better men. I spent Thursday night in a ritual of preparation. I didn't just polish my shoes. I stripped the old wax and rebuilt the shine layer by layer until I could see the structural integrity of the room in the leather. I trimmed my hair with a steady hand. I practiced the walk, not the slumped, invisible shuffle of the driver, but the measured, ground-eating stride of the man who owned the room. I looked at the watch Matteo had given me from the locker, the Patek Philippe. It was a masterpiece of gears and tension, perfectly silent. "Time is the only currency that matters, Noah," my mentor had told me when he gave it to me. "The rich spend it, the poor sell it, but the wise, they wait for it." My time had been sold for 3 years. Tomorrow night I was going to buy it back. The transformation was subtle but total. By the time I finished, the man in the mirror was a stranger again. He wasn't Noah the driver. He wasn't even the old Noah Thorne. He was something new, a man who had been through the dark and wasn't afraid of what he found there. I packed the tuxedo into a nondescript duffel bag. I would drive Julian to the event in my uniform. I would be the performance Art he wanted. I would let him lead me into the room like a dog on a leash, because the best way to destroy a man's world is to let him show you exactly where the walls are thinnest. As the sun began to rise on Friday, I sat by the window and watched the city wake up. The skyscrapers caught the first light, turning into pillars of gold. Julian would be calling soon, demanding his coffee, demanding his car, demanding his life be served to him on a silver platter. I checked the watch. The second hand swept across the face with terrifying grace. One more day, I whispered to the empty room. One more day in the shadow. The Blackwood estate sat atop a jagged cliff like a fortress made of limestone and arrogance. As I steered the Maybach up the winding driveway, the headlights swept over a line of luxury vehicles that looked like a catalog of excess. Porsches, Bentleys, and custom Ferraris were parked in a neat row, their polished surfaces gleaming under the moonlight. In the back seat, Julian was vibrating with a frantic, nervous energy. He had been drinking gin since we left the city, and his face was flushed. He kept checking his reflection, adjusting his industrialist costume, a velvet waistcoat and a gold-handled cane that looked ridiculous in his hands. "Remember, Noah," he slurred, leaning forward to tap the glass partition. "You don't speak unless I tell you to. You stay 3 paces behind me. You are the silent laborer. That's the bit. If you ruin the punchline, I'll make sure you never drive a tricycle in this town again." "I understand, Mr. Vane," I said. My voice was as cold as the sleet hitting the roof. I parked the car in the designated area. The valets, dressed in period-accurate newsboy caps, hurried over. I ignored them. I stepped out, opened Julian's door, and stood at attention. Julian stepped out, took a deep breath of the mountain air, and smoothed his waistcoat. "Check the duffel in the trunk," Julian commanded. "Is my prop ready?" "It is, sir." He didn't know that the duffel bag in the trunk didn't contain a prop. It contained the midnight blue tuxedo and the Patek Philippe. I had swapped them at the detailing shop. As we approached the massive oak doors of the manor, the sounds of a live orchestra drifted out, violins playing something sharp and discordant. We entered the foyer, and the heat of 1,000 candles hit us. The room was a sea of velvet, lace, and top hats. Men who had never worked a day in their lives were dressed as coal barons, and women draped in millions of dollars of silk were playing at being factory girls. It was a grotesque display of wealth mocking the very labor that created it. Julian spotted Sterling across the room and puffed out his chest. "Watch this," he whispered to me. He marched over, dragging me along like a tethered shadow. "Sterling, look who I brought. The most authentic piece of history in the room. Meet my silent driver. He hasn't broken character in 3 years." Sterling turned, his eyes glazed with champagne. He looked at me, squinting. "Oh, the one from the car? Marvelous. He's got that, what do you call it, that gray look, like he's made of soot. Well done, Julian." A small circle gathered around us. People leaned in, examining me as if I were a statue in a museum. I kept my gaze fixed on a point 6 inches above Julian's head. I didn't blink. I didn't move. I let them use their cruelest jokes, their sharpest barbs. I let them talk about my vacant stare and my failed potential. "Does he eat?" a woman in a feathered hat asked, poking my arm with her fan. "Only when I tell him he's a good boy," Julian laughed, and the circle erupted in a chorus of high society cackling. But then the room shifted. The heavy doors at the far end of the ballroom opened, and Arthur Blackwood stepped out. He was the host, a man of 70 with eyes like flint. Beside him was Clara. She looked stunning in a deep emerald gown, but her expression was one of bored tolerance. She had heard these jokes 1,000 times. Julian straightened up, desperate to catch Blackwood's eye. He wanted the endorsement. He wanted the merger. Arthur Blackwood began to move through the crowd, his presence acting like a magnet. People parted for him. He nodded to Sterling, ignored the woman with the fan, and headed toward Julian. Julian's face lit up like a Christmas tree. "Arthur." "A wonderful evening," Julian started, extending his hand. But Arthur Blackwood didn't see Julian's hand. He wasn't even looking at Julian. His eyes were locked on me. He slowed down, his brow furrowed in a look of profound confusion that quickly sharpened into recognition. The laughter in our little circle began to die down. The silence started at the center and rippled outward. It was a heavy, physical thing, the kind of silence that happens right before a lightning strike. Arthur Blackwood stopped 3 feet away from me. He ignored Julian completely, who was still standing there with his hand out like a beggar. Blackwood looked at my frayed suit. He looked at my neutral expression. And then he looked into my eyes. "No," Blackwood whispered, his voice carrying further than a shout. "It's not possible." Clara stepped up beside him, her gaze following his. I saw the moment she recognized me. I saw the glass of champagne in her hand tremble. I saw the color drain from her face until she was as white as the lilies in the vases. "Noah," she breathed. The word was small, but in the sudden, vacuum-like silence of the ballroom, it sounded like a gunshot. Julian looked from me to Blackwood, then back to me. "Arthur, you know my driver? He's a nobody, part of the costume." Arthur Blackwood turned to Julian, and for a second, I thought the old man was going to strike him. "Your driver?" Blackwood's voice was a low growl of pure disgust. "You idiot. You're standing in the presence of the man who gave you your first contract. You're standing in the presence of the man who owns the very ground you're standing on." The silence in the room wasn't just quiet anymore. It was a suffocating weight. Every head in the ballroom turned. Every conversation stopped. The silent laborer wasn't a prop anymore. I didn't say a word. I just slowly lowered my gaze until I was looking Julian Vane directly in the eye. For the first time in 3 years, the driver was gone. "The car is parked out front, Mr. Vane," I said, my voice echoing in the stillness. "I suggest you go find someone else to drive you home." "Because I'm finished." The air in the ballroom felt as though it had been sucked out by a vacuum. The only sound was the faint rhythmic ticking of the Patek Philippe hidden beneath my sleeve, a heartbeat of precision in a room full of chaotic, shallow breaths. Julian's hand, still extended for a handshake that was never coming, began to shake. He looked at Arthur Blackwood, then at the silent, watching crowd, and finally back at me. His face was a mask of flickering emotions, confusion, denial, and then a creeping, soul-deep terror. "Noah?" Julian stammered, his voice thin and high. "Arthur, you're mistaken. He's been my driver for 3 years. He's a nobody. He lives in a studio in the industrial district. He picks up my dry cleaning." Arthur Blackwood didn't even look at Julian. He stepped closer to me, his flinty eyes softening with a respect that bordered on reverence. 3 years, Blackwood murmured, shaking his head. "We thought you were dead, Noah. We thought the pressure had finally cracked the only man who knew how to balance this city's scales." "I wasn't cracked, Arthur," I said, my voice projecting with a natural authority that made Julian flinch. "I was just observing. It's amazing how much more you can see when people think you're part of the furniture." Clara stepped forward then. The emerald of her dress seemed to vibrate against the paleness of her skin. She looked at me, not as the deadweight husband she had discarded, but as the architect she had once feared. "You let me believe you were gone," she whispered, her voice thick with a mixture of betrayal and sudden, desperate realization. "You let me watch you fall." "I didn't fall, Clara," I replied, looking her in the eye without a shred of the old apology. "I stepped down. There's a difference, and I didn't let you believe anything. You saw exactly what you wanted to see, a man who was no longer useful to your ambition. The crowd was leaning in now. The coal barons and factory girls were no longer playing a game. They were witnessing a tectonic shift. Sterling, who had earlier mocked the frayed edges of my suit, looked as though he wanted to melt into the floorboards. Noah Thorne, Sterling muttered, the name spreading through the room like a wildfire. The Thorne Initiative, the 2021 algorithm. The man who vanished. Julian's knees actually buckled. He grabbed the back of a nearby chair for support. Thorne, he choked out. You're the Thorne, but I've been treating you like a servant? I finished for him. Like a lawnmower? Yes, Julian. You were very consistent. You showed me exactly who you are when you think no one is watching. And more importantly, you showed me exactly how you've been managing the Thorne legacy accounts. The silence deepened. I turned my back on Julian, the ultimate gesture of dismissal, and faced the room. For 3 years I sat in the front seat while many of you sat in the back. I heard the insider tips. I heard the plans to strip the Thorne patents. I heard the jokes about the fool who walked away from billions. I looked at the high-ranking board members scattered throughout the crowd. The 4th Street Bridge Project, the Series B funding for Von Corp, the illegal offshore sheltering of the Q3 losses. I have the logs, I have the dates, and as of 8 p.m. tonight, I have the majority voting block for the Thorne Initiative's restructuring. A collective gasp rippled through the hall. Julian let out a low, whimpering sound. He realized then that the performance art he had brought to the party wasn't me. It was his own life, and the curtain had just fallen. Arthur Blackwood smiled then, a slow, grim expression of triumph. He raised his glass toward me. The architect has returned to the house. It seems the industrial age is over, and the age of accountability has begun. Clara reached out, her fingers brushing my sleeve, her eyes searching for the man who used to give in to her every whim. Noah, we can talk about this, the merger. We can make it work, together. I pulled my arm away, not with anger, but with a cold, final indifference. The merger is dead, Clara. And so is the man you think you're talking to. The driver is finished. And the architect? He's moving on to bigger projects. I turned to the doors. I didn't need to stay for the fallout. The recognition was the catalyst. The reaction was now inevitable. As I walked through the parting crowd, the silence followed me, a mark of respect I hadn't earned through wealth, but through the terrifying power of a man who had seen the bottom and wasn't afraid to go back. Behind me I heard the first of the voices, not laughing but frantic. The sound of 100 elite players realizing their nobody had just become their judge. I walked out of the ballroom and onto the terrace, the cold mountain air hitting my face like a baptism. Behind me, the muffled sounds of the gala had changed. The music had stopped. The high-pitched social laughter was replaced by the low, frantic hum of people who suddenly needed to check their portfolios. I didn't get far. A shadow detached itself from the stone pillars near the garden path. It was a man I hadn't seen in the ballroom, someone who didn't need a costume to look like he belonged in the 19th century, or any century where power was the only language. It was Elias Vance, the CEO of Global Sovereign, the largest private equity firm in the hemisphere. He was the man Julian had been trying to get a meeting with for 3 years. You always did have a flair for the dramatic, Noah, Vance said, his voice a deep, resonant rumble. He stepped into the light, a cigar unlit between his fingers. The silent driver. It's poetic, a bit masochistic perhaps, but poetic. It wasn't about drama, Elias, I said, stopping. It was about perspective. And did you find it? Vance stepped closer, his eyes scanning me with the clinical precision of a man who dealt in nations rather than companies. Did the view from the front seat change the way you see the board? It made me realize the board is smaller than I thought, and much more fragile. Vance nodded, a small, tight smile playing on his lips. Good, because I didn't come to this ridiculous party to watch Julian Vane make a fool of himself. I came because my analyst told me that someone had been quietly buying up the distressed debt of the Thorne Initiative. Someone using a fragmented network of shell companies that all trace back to a single dormant server in the industrial district. He paused, letting the implication hang in the air. I assumed it was a hostile takeover from a foreign competitor, Vance continued. But then I saw you walk into the room tonight in that uniform, and I realized it wasn't a takeover. It was a recovery. Inside the ballroom, a loud crash echoed, the sound of a tray of crystal glasses hitting the floor. Someone was shouting. Julian's voice, shrill and desperate, rose above the din. The collapse was starting. I have a proposal, Noah, Vance said, his tone shifting to business. The Thorn Initiative patents are the backbone of the next generation of infrastructure. Under Julian and Clara, they were being sold for parts. Under Sovereign, they could be the foundation of a global standard. He reached into his coat and pulled out a single, encrypted tablet. On the screen was a contract. It wasn't a merger. It was a sovereign partnership. I don't want to buy you out, Noah. I want to back you. Total autonomy, total funding. You stay the architect. We provide the steel. We'll wipe Julian's name from the filings by dawn. He'll be lucky if he's left with the clothes he's wearing. And Clara? She'll be invited to resign from the board before the markets open on Monday. I looked at the tablet. For 3 years I had lived on less than $30,000 a year. I had eaten in diners and slept on a mattress that smelled of damp. Now, with a single thumbprint, I could be one of the most powerful men on the planet again. What's the catch, Elias? No catch. Just the inevitability of your talent. You were never meant to be a ghost, Noah. You were meant to be the one who draws the lines everyone else has to follow. I looked back at the manor. Through the glass I could see Julian. He was backed into a corner, surrounded by 3 investors who looked like they were ready to tear him apart. He looked small. He looked like the nobody he had accused me of being. The stakes had crystallized. This wasn't just about revenge. It was about whether I was willing to step back into the fire. I'll take the offer, I said, my voice steady. But on one condition. Name it, Vance replied. The industrial district where I've been living. The garage. The people who work in the shadows. They get first priority in the new infrastructure. We don't build over them. We build for them. Vance chuckled, a dry, appreciative sound. Still an idealist. It's a miracle you survived this long. Fine, consider it done. I pressed my thumb to the tablet. A soft green light flickered. Across the city, in 1,000 data centers, the ownership of the Thorn Initiative shifted. The locks changed. The bank accounts froze. The empire I had built was finally back in my hands. Welcome back to the world, Noah, Vance said, extending his hand. I didn't take it. Not yet. I'm not back yet, Elias. I still have to finish the evening. I turned and walked back toward the manor. I didn't feel like a billionaire. I didn't feel like a hero. I felt like a man who had finally put the right keys on the table. When I stepped back through the terrace doors, the ballroom felt like a sinking ship. The orchestra had long since abandoned their instruments, leaving a silence that was punctuated only by the sharp, desperate whispers of people trying to calculate their own survival. Julian was at the center of a shrinking circle. His face was no longer flushed with gin. It was a sickly, translucent white. He was clutching his gold-handled cane so tightly his knuckles were bloodless. "It's a glitch!" Julian was shouting at a group of stone-faced men in dinner jackets. "A technical error. I am the CEO of Vene Corp. My accounts are secured by the most advanced." "Your accounts are empty, Julian." My voice wasn't loud, but it acted like a blade, cutting through his hysterics. The circle of investors parted instantly, creating a path between me and the man who had spent 3 years calling me a lawnmower. Julian spun around, his eyes wide and bloodshot. You did something to the servers. I'll have you arrested for corporate espionage. I didn't do anything to your servers, Julian," I said, stepping into the light. I was no longer the man in the frayed suit. The way I stood, the way I breathed, it was the architect. I simply exercised the buyback clauses you ignored in the Q2 filings. You were so busy disrupting the market that you failed to notice the Thorn Initiative had a poison pill provision, one that triggers the moment the lead investor is found to be in breach of fiduciary duty. "I haven't breached anything," he screamed. "You used Thorn patent equity to secure personal loans for your lifestyle," I said, my voice clinical and cold. "You used company funds to pay for this gala, and you've been sheltering losses in a shell company that, as of 10 minutes ago, is owned by Global Sovereign." Julian looked around the room, searching for an ally. He looked at Sterling. Sterling looked at the ceiling. He looked at the woman with the fan. She turned her back on him. "Sterling," Julian whispered. "We had a deal. We had a deal with a winner, Julian," Sterling said, his voice dripping with icy pragmatism. "I don't know who you are, and frankly, after tonight, I don't think anyone else will either." Clara stood a few feet away, her arms crossed, her emerald gown suddenly looking like armor that had failed. She wasn't screaming. She was watching me with a terrifying, calculating stillness. She knew the game was over. She was already trying to figure out how to pivot, how to survive the blast radius. "Noah," she said, her voice low, "you're destroying everything we built. Think about the legacy." "I am thinking about the legacy, Clara," I replied. "That's why I'm taking it away from you. You turned a vision into a vanity project. You traded the sun for the spotlight." Julian lunged forward then, his cane raised as if he intended to strike me. It was a pathetic, clumsy movement. He didn't even get close. Two of Arthur Blackwood's security detail, men who had seen me drive Julian to the estate a dozen times, stepped in front of him. They didn't move with aggression. They moved with the professional indifference one uses to remove a piece of trash from a sidewalk. "Get your hands off me," Julian shrieked. "Do you know who I am?" "We know exactly who you are, Mr. Vane," one of the guards said. "You're a trespasser. Your invitation has been revoked by the owner of the estate." "The owner?" Julian looked at Arthur Blackwood. Blackwood didn't say a word. He simply gestured toward me. The realization hit Julian like a physical weight. His knees finally gave out, and he slumped into a velvet chair that was worth more than my studio apartment. He looked down at his hands that had never known a day of real work, and he started to shake. There was no explosion, no grand confrontation, just the sound of a man's ego collapsing in on itself in a room full of people who had already forgotten his name. I didn't stay to watch him be escorted out. I didn't need the satisfaction of seeing him hail a taxi or walk down the long winding driveway. In the dark, power shifts in silence. It doesn't need to scream. It just moves from the hands of the loud to the hands of the capable. I looked at the ballroom one last time. These people had mocked me for 3 years. They had used my silence as a canvas for their own arrogance. And now, they were all waiting for me to speak, to lead, to give them a reason to believe they were still important. I gave them nothing. I turned and walked toward the coat room. The performance art was over. The noise of the ballroom, the frantic negotiations, the weeping of Julian's shattered ego, the desperate attempts of the elite to pivot toward the new center of gravity, began to fade as I walked toward the heavy oak doors. I reached the cloakroom where I had stood just hours ago as a ghost. The attendant, the same young man who had looked through me like I was made of glass when I arrived, was now standing at rigid attention. His hands were shaking as he reached for the duffel bag I had left behind. "Mr. Thorne," he whispered, his voice cracking. I have your things, sir. I've already moved them to a private car. Mr. Blackwood's personal driver is waiting." "Thank you," I said. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a $100 bill, the last of my driver's cash. I placed it on the counter, for the hospitality. I didn't wait for him to respond. I stepped out into the night. The sleet had stopped, leaving the world wrapped in a cold, shimmering silence. The mountain air felt clean, stripped of the heavy perfumes and the stale scent of bourbon that clung to the ballroom. In the driveway, the Maybach sat under the glow of the manor's lights, looking abandoned. It was no longer a symbol of power. It was just a pile of metal and leather, a relic of a man who no longer existed in the eyes of the city. A sleek silver sedan was idling near the entrance. The driver, a man I knew from years ago, stepped out and opened the door. "Noah," he said, a simple nod of respect. "Wait a moment, Leo," I said. I looked back at the Blackwood estate. Through the massive glass windows, I could see the silhouettes of the guests. They were still huddled in groups, their shadows long and jagged against the light. I saw Clara come out onto the terrace. She looked around, her emerald dress a dark smudge against the stone. She spotted me by the car. She didn't move. She didn't wave. She just stood there, watching the man she thought she had buried drive away for the second time. This time, however, there was no anger between us. There was just a vast, unbridgeable distance. She was staying in the world of shadows and mirrors. I was leaving it behind. I climbed into the back seat. The interior was quiet, the air crisp and neutral. No heavy cologne, no shouting on the phone, no rapping of a signet ring against the glass. "Where to, sir?" Leo asked. "The penthouse has been prepared. The staff is on standby." I leaned my head back against the headrest and closed my eyes. For 3 years I had navigated the city's streets, every turn dictated by someone else's whim. I knew every pothole, every shortcut, every red light. I had been a servant to the clock. "Not the penthouse," I said. "Sir, take me back to the industrial district. To the garage." Leo hesitated, his eyes meeting mine in the rearview mirror. "Mr. Vance said you'd want to be moved into the new headquarters immediately. The press is already beginning to pick up the story of the Thorne restructuring. The press can wait until Monday," I said, my voice calm but final. "Tonight, I'm still a guest of the people who didn't need to see a tuxedo to know my name." As the car began its descent down the mountain, the lights of the estate vanished behind the trees. I felt a profound sense of lightness. I had gone into that room not to take revenge, but to reclaim my dignity. Revenge is loud, it requires an audience and a victim. Dignity is quiet, it only requires the truth. I had watched Julian fall, but I hadn't pushed him. I had simply stepped out of the way and let his own momentum destroy him. I pulled the midnight blue tuxedo jacket from the duffel bag and laid it across the seat. I took off the Patek Philippe and placed it in its wooden box. I sat there in my white shirt and black trousers, the uniform of the invisible. We reached the city limits. The skyscrapers were glowing, a million windows representing a million lives being lived in the machinery I had helped build. I didn't feel the need to own them anymore. I didn't need my name on the side of a building to know I existed. We pulled up to the garage in the industrial district. It was nearly 2 a.m. Henderson was sitting on a plastic crate outside the bay, smoking a cigarette, his breath trailing off into the cold air. When he saw the silver sedan, he stood up, squinting. I stepped out of the car. Henderson looked at the car, then at me, then at the driver. He saw the way Leo stood, the way the car hummed. He looked back at my face, really looked at it. "Noah?" he asked, his voice rough. "What happened to Vane?" "He found a different way home, Henderson," I said. I walked over to the bay and sat down on a crate next to him. "You got an extra cigarette?" Henderson stared at me for a long beat, then slowly reached into his pocket and handed me one. "I knew you were too precise for this job," he muttered, shaking his head as he struck a light. "I just didn't know you were the one who owned the garage." "I don't own it yet," I said, watching the smoke drift up toward the rusted rafters. "But by Monday morning, we're going to need more bays. We've got a lot of work to do." I sat there in the dark with the man who had seen me when I was nothing. There was no drama, no celebration, just the quiet understanding of a man who had finally finished his shift. The fallout was not a storm. It was a cold front that froze the city's financial district overnight. By Monday morning, the name Julian Vane had been scrubbed from the digital directories of the Vane Tower with a surgical efficiency. The news cycle, which had spent years praising his disruptive genius, pivoted with the predatory instinct of a shark. The headlines were brutal: the driver who owned the road and the great Thorn deception. I watched the news from a small television in the corner of Henderson's office. I was back in my old work clothes, a simple denim shirt and khakis. The silver sedan was gone. The tuxedo was back in its locker. I sat with a lukewarm cup of coffee, watching the footage of federal agents carrying boxes out of Julian's penthouse. Julian himself was caught by a paparazzi lens as he left a courthouse. He wasn't wearing the velvet waistcoat or the gold-handled cane. He looked haggard, his hair unwashed, wearing a windbreaker that made him look like a stranger to his own life. Without the money, without the car, and without the man in the front seat to give him a sense of scale, he had simply shriveled. His venture capital firm had collapsed within 48 hours. Global Sovereign had called in the debts, and because Julian had used the Thorn patents as collateral, patents he no longer controlled, he was personally liable for hundreds of millions. He wasn't just broke, he was a liability. He was a monument to failure. Clara fared better, but only in the way a ghost fares better than a corpse. She visited the garage on Tuesday evening. She arrived in a modest car, one she was driving herself. She stepped into the oil-stained bay, her designer heels clicking against the concrete, a sound that used to make me stand at attention. Now, it just sounded out of sync. "Noah," she said, stopping a few feet away. She didn't look at the garage with disgust this time. She looked at it with a strange, haunting curiosity. "You really are staying here?" "For now," I said, wiping a wrench with a rag. "The foundations are better here. I resigned this morning," she said, her voice hollow. Elias Vance made it clear that my presence on the board was a distraction. He offered me a settlement. "Enough to live on if I'm careful." "And will you be careful, Clara?" She looked at me, and for a fleeting second I saw the woman I had married, the one who dreamt of building things, not just owning them. "I don't know how to be anything else," she whispered. "You won, Noah. You stripped him of everything. You stripped me of my pride. Are you satisfied?" "I didn't win anything, Clara. I just stopped participating in the lie. If you feel stripped, it's because you were wearing things that didn't belong to you." She stood there for a long moment, the silence of the garage stretching between us like a canyon. She realized then that there was no rekindling, no strategic alliance to be made. I was a man who had moved beyond the reach of her ambition. She turned and walked out, her silhouette disappearing into the city lights. I never saw her again. As for the others, the ones who had mocked me at the gala, the consequences were more subtle. Sterling was forced into early retirement after an internal audit revealed he had been complicit in Julian's efficiency gains. The woman with the fan, whose family wealth was tied to the very infrastructure I now controlled, found her social invitations drying up. The social reversal was permanent. In the high society circles, my name became a cautionary tale. I was the ghost who came back. I was the reminder that the man serving your coffee or driving your car might just be the one holding the mortgage on your soul. I spent the rest of the week with Henderson, restructuring the garage, We weren't just fixing cars anymore. We were setting up a training program for the neighborhood kids, teaching them the mechanics of the new systems Elias Vance and I were deploying. I was no longer the driver. I was the architect again, but this time I wasn't building glass towers for the elite. I was building a floor for the people who had been walking on the ground. The money started flowing back into the Thorn Initiative accounts, not as profit for shareholders, but as fuel for the vision I had abandoned 3 years ago. I was back at the top, but the view was different. From the bottom, you see the cracks in the world. From the top, you have the tools to fix them. Julian Vane was eventually sentenced to 3 years for fraud. On the day he went in, he reportedly asked if he could have a private car to take him to the facility. The request was denied. He took the bus. 6 months later, the city was different, though only the observant could see why. The Thorn Initiative's new headquarters wasn't a glass tower in the financial district. It was a repurposed industrial complex in the heart of the district where I had spent my years as a ghost. We kept the brick, the iron, and the history. We just added the future. I stood on the roof of the complex as the sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the skyline in shades of bruised purple and burning gold. Below me, the city hummed. It was a sound I used to listen to from the front seat of a Maybach, a sound of chaos and greed. Now it sounded like a machine that was finally being oiled. My phone buzzed in my pocket. It wasn't an encrypted alert or a desperate plea from a former associate. It was a text from Henderson. The first fleet of the new transit line is ready for inspection. And Noah, the kid from the corner, he just passed his lead technician exam. I smiled, a genuine quiet warmth spreading through me. That was the only valuation that mattered now. I walked to the edge of the roof and looked toward the center of the city. In the distance, the old Vane Tower, now renamed and under new management, flickered with the lights of 1,000 office workers. On the side of the building, a massive digital billboard was being replaced. The image of Julian Vane, the disruptor, was gone. In its place was a simple, elegant logo of the Thorn Initiative. Underneath it, the company's new motto, "Built to last." Built for all. I thought about the night of the gala. I thought about the weight of the silver keys on the mahogany table. I realized then that I hadn't just reclaimed a company. I had reclaimed the part of myself that believed the world could be better. I had spent 3 years learning how to be invisible, only to realize that the most important work is often done by those no one bothers to look at. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a small, worn object. It was a simple brass key, the key to the first garage bay Henderson had given me. It was a reminder of the cold mornings, the smell of grease, and the dignity of a job well done. I looked down at the street. A black sedan pulled up to the entrance of the complex. A man stepped out looking at his watch, his posture radiating the same frantic self-importance I had seen in 1,000 Julians. He looked up at the building, his eyes scanning the windows, searching for the power he assumed lived inside. He didn't see me. I was just a silhouette against the setting sun. I turned away from the edge. I didn't need to be seen anymore. I didn't need the applause or the recognition of a room full of people in costumes. I had the work. I had the people who knew my name when I was nothing. And I had the silence, not the silence of a man who has been silenced, but the silence of a man who has nothing left to prove. I walked toward the stairwell, my footsteps echoing with a steady, purposeful rhythm. The architect was home. The last thing the city saw before the sun disappeared was the light in the old industrial district turning on, one by one, until the darkness was pushed back entirely. I never looked back. If you believe real power doesn't need to prove itself, like the video, subscribe, and stay tuned for more cinematic stories of patience, resilience, and earned victory.